Great. Well, thanks so much. Good morning and good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Yes, my name is Anya Clark, and I am head of KnowTheChain and investor strategy for the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. And together with my colleague Rosie Monaghan, who's the senior researcher for KnowTheChain, we're going to deep dive into KnowTheChain's 2025-26 benchmark methodology. And we're going to try and keep this session as short as possible and provide plenty of time for questions and feedback. So please do keep yourselves on mute for this session. And if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or put the question in the Q&A box, and we'll go through and answer them at the end. And as you can see, the session is being recorded for those who can't make it today, but we are going to turn the recording off for the question and answer session. So if you do have anything a bit more sensitive or, sensitive to raise, please do so. Feel free. It's a safe space here to raise any questions that you want. Excellent. So I'm just going to dive straight in. I mean, I know that we have a number of very familiar faces on the call, and we appreciate your continued engagement with KnowTheChain. But there are some new faces in the crowd, and for those people, it will be really good to just briefly outline what KnowTheChain is and what it does. And so we are a program of the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. We are in practice a tool, a resource for companies and investors to better understand and address forced labor risks and labor rights risks within their supply chains. We use benchmarking as a way to build on the competitive dynamics and reputational risks to create a race to the top in corporate practice. Now, we've been benchmarking companies across three high-risk sectors, the apparel and footwear, the ICT, and the food and beverage sectors since 2016. So if you can believe it or not, this is our fifth biannual cycle of benchmarks. Our methodology is broadly aligned with the UN guiding principles in assessing how companies are identifying, mitigating, and remedying labor rights risks in their supply chains. We also map our indicators against the OECD guidelines for responsible business conduct and the Global Reporting Initiative, so the GRI. Our indicators on commitment and governance, risk assessment, and grievance mechanisms align very neatly with the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or the CSRD. Their ESRS 5 standards, for those who know the lingo, in terms of the workers in the value chain piece, are broadly aligned with our indicators on, as I say, risk assessment, grievance mechanisms, and commitment and governance. And we're currently undertaking a mapping exercise for the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which we should publish later on this year. So just briefly around the processes and the data that we use. The data that we use comes from English language disclosures on company websites, ESG and annual reports, proxy statements, and anything that's published on the company's website. So media briefings, and others. We also accept additional disclosure from companies during the formal response period, and we incorporate allegations of abuse from reputable media and third-party reports and publish company responses alongside them. So our target company list is based on market capitalization and the percentage of revenues derived from own branded products. We also tailored the list slightly for better regional diversification. So we're capturing the largest companies by market capitalization globally. And our methodology has evolved alongside evolving legislative developments, including human rights due diligence legislation, and increased stakeholder expectations, including from consumers and also investors. And we incorporate the feedback from companies, trade unions, civil society organizations, and investors into those methodology revisions year on year. And so you'll see there that the company engagement rate is between 55 and 60%, which is pretty good. But we're always looking to improve that figure. Companies that formally engage with us do tend to perform better in the benchmark. So it's really in your interest to reach out, formally engage with us, and provide additional disclosure where possible. As I'll go into in our approach and our timeframes, there are formal engagement periods where you can do that, but we're also very happy to field any questions and have calls with you outside of that period as well. So just in terms of a little bit of background on the process, the timeline for putting together a benchmark takes about 9 months. It can take up to 4 months to do the initial company research. After we do that initial research, we will send that to you for your review and for you to provide additional links or additional disclosure that you can either publish on your website or we publish on ours. And we will incorporate that additional disclosure where relevant and appropriate into the initial research that we have gathered. This formal engagement period will last for about 2 months. And as mentioned, we provide plenty of opportunity for those one-to-one calls. And finally, over a period of 3 months, the information is aggregated, the scores are finalized, analysis is completed, and the report is drafted and published. So ICT is the first sector that we're analyzing within this current benchmarking cycle, and that will take us up to March next year. We will start the initial research period in June, and you can expect that additional disclosure period to start probably in October, November time. But you can check out all that additional information on our website, and we'll provide you the links for that at the end of the presentation. And so without then further ado, I'll just hand over to my colleague, Rosie Monaghan, who will take us through the methodology revision and updated criteria for this year's cycle.
Thanks, Anya. So I'm just going to talk through sort of a summary of the key changes that we've made. But before I do, just want to emphasize that the changes we've made overall are not major, and they're not going to result in major scoring shifts compared with previous years. So if you're anyone on the call who's familiar with the last round of methodology changes that we made back in 2022, the edits that we've made this time are not at all on par or on the same level as that. So structurally, the methodology remains the same, and the substantive changes are quite minor. So the revisions we've made for the 2025 to 26 methodology were focused mostly on aligning the language of our indicators in 2 ways. So firstly, making our existing scoring criteria clearer in the indicator language. So as many of you will know, we've got partial and full scoring available across our indicators, and there were a few places where we felt that our existing criteria for full points could be clearer in the indicator language itself. And then the second point of alignment was with international standards. So an example of this is where we've now explicitly mentioned the ILO definition of recruitment fees in our recruitment fee indicator, although we were already using this as part of our assessment. And then there were 3 areas where we felt that our indicators were not working as well as they could be. So purchasing practices, grievance mechanisms, and monitoring. On purchasing practices, we brought in some kind of broader framing to the previous criteria. And this was so that we could take into account all pricing mechanisms that are designed to address or protect labour costs in pricing. And previously, this was phrased only to look at ring fencing of labour costs. And the reason we made this change was to ensure our methodology was applicable to and capturing all relevant practices across the 3 sectors we work in. And I can explain that a little bit more in a couple of slides. On grievance mechanisms, we also felt that we could be measuring this more accurately, so we incorporated the indicator in the indicator language a requirement for the mechanism to be communicated to suppliers workers as well. And then on monitoring, we reintegrated some criteria around unannounced audits, and unannounced assessments were captured in earlier iterations of the KnowTheChain methodology, and got cut when we made more major changes last year and reduced the number of indicators we were looking at. But given a lot of the difficulties and challenges with social auditing, we felt that this was one criteria it was worth reintegrating. So just then taking a step back a bit from some of the changes, this is the overall structure of our methodology, comprised of 7 themes. As Anya mentioned already, these are broadly based on the UNGPs, with theme 1 covering commitment, themes 2 to 6 covering various forms of due diligence, and theme 7 covering remedy. One change to mention here relates to theme 5, which was previously titled Worker Voice, and this has been updated to enabling workers' rights. But the content of what is measured under that theme remains the same. So we've got 2 indicators measured there, one on freedom of association and one on grievance mechanisms, and nothing has changed except for the title of the theme. And the reason for this change is that worker voice is now being increasingly used in a number of different contexts and means a lot of different things to different stakeholders. So we decided to move away from using this term. And then on the next slide, this is to show the key changes that we've made in a bit more detail, including the new indicator language. So one change that I haven't mentioned yet is this first one on indicator 1.2. For full points, this indicator previously required measuring the effectiveness of capacity building. And this was another indicator that we've kind of opened up to more sort of broad options. So now we would look for detail on either the frequency, participants, or content of the capacity building as it relates to forced labor. And this is, again, sort of a change made to try and get closer to the quality of the training or capacity building being conducted. On purchasing practices, indicator 6.2, the 3 key elements we're looking for are planning, forecasting, and pricing that includes the full cost of production. Whereas, as I just mentioned, this previously looked at planning, forecasting, and ring fencing of labor costs in pricing negotiations. So that element that looks at pricing specifically has been adapted to look at what mechanisms companies are using to ensure that pricing covers the full cost of production, including labor costs and ultimately a living wage. But it is worth mentioning that we're not expecting companies to have achieved pricing that includes a living wage in order to get full points here. So I just want to emphasize that. And that is the reason that the indicator language specifies take steps to ensure, so that we can kind of capture the different stages that companies are at in doing this. On grievance mechanisms, the change is relatively self-explanatory. So we now want to see the mechanism is being communicated to suppliers, workers, and companies won't be able to get a full score on the indicator unless this is clear. And then finally, on monitoring, indicator 11.1, we integrated into the language the basic methodology we already required for any points to be awarded under this indicator. So that's on-site worker interviews, reviews of relevant documentation, and on-site visits, including to associated production facilities. So this was, again, something that we were already requiring, but it wasn't explicit in the indicator language. And in addition, the indicator now looks at the scope of audits. So we would want to know what proportion of suppliers are being monitored against that methodology. I think, again, this is something that we kind of were picking up quite regularly in company disclosure, but not actually requiring in the indicator. And then finally, as I mentioned already, we reintegrated the unannounced assessment criteria. And there will be more detail on this indicator and the criteria that we're applying in the reporting guidance, which we're going to be publishing in the next couple of weeks. So that's all actually on the changes, but just wanted to reiterate that the key focuses of the methodology and of KnowTheChain remain on the implementation of policies and processes and the outcomes that they're resulting in, what actions companies are taking beyond the first tier of their supply chains, and the integration of stakeholder engagement throughout all themes and processes. And And then there's also included for here for reference a list of indicators that do incorporate some focus on lower tier risks. We will share these slides around so that you can take a closer look at that if it's of interest. And just on the next slide, to give an example of what we mean when we talk about an emphasis on practice over policy, this is one of our indicators focused on recruitment fees, where you can see 20% of the indicator relates to the disclosure of a policy, and the remaining 80% looks at the implementation and outcomes of that policy. So the due diligence steps taken on that policy and remediation where the policy has been breached. And then finally, a summary of our resources, which are all available on our website. You can find the benchmark timelines, methodology, and company lists on our website. They're all hyperlinked here. And we also have a few upcoming resources worth mentioning. So a translation of our methodology into Japanese will be coming out in the next couple of weeks. The reporting guidance, which I already mentioned, which accompanies our methodology, will also be ready in the next couple of weeks. So it goes into more detail on the partial and full scoring for each of the indicators, and gives good practice examples as well. We always distribute this to companies alongside the initial research when that gets sent out, but this year we'll be publishing it on our website too. Later in the year, we'll be publishing a good practice guide for companies, which will be based on all the data from our 2022 to 23 benchmarks, and drawing on the data from all three sectors. And finally, as Anya mentioned, we're going to be publishing a document highlighting where we align with other standards or regulations, including the EU's CSDDD. So that's it for now. Anya, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Rosie. So I did say we were going to keep it short and sweet. So hopefully that provides enough of an overview of changes and the methodology before we head into this next round of benchmarking.